My name is Nadia Holt, and I'm 31. 2 nights before my wedding, in the middle of the rehearsal, my mother grabbed my arm and hissed, "Put your grandfather in the kitchen with the staff. He doesn't belong with our real guests. Look at him, still smells like dirt and cheap soap." My stepfather smirked and added, "This is a networking night, not a charity dinner." The man they wanted hidden in the back had raised me alone after my grandmother died of cancer and my father walked out. He'd sold everything he had so I could eat and go to school. I looked my mother straight in the eyes and said, "No. He sits with me." They stormed off. What neither of them knew was that my stepfather's own CEO, the woman whose name he dropped at every dinner party, had spent 27 years searching for exactly one person in this world. And that night, she finally found him. To understand what happened at that reception in front of 138 people, you have to understand who my grandfather really is. Not who my mother pretended he was. Not what my stepfather called him behind closed doors. The real man. His name is Emmett Calloway. He's 80 years old, and he lives in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Millhaven, a town where the mailbox is lean and the tomatoes ripen a little too late every October. For 25 years he drove a school bus along the same rural route, wearing the same navy jacket with a coffee stain that never quite washed out. He knew every kid on that route by name, which ones had a parent working nights, which ones needed an extra pack of crackers in September, which ones would cry if the bus ran 2 minutes late. He never told their parents any of it. He just kept crackers under the seat. I moved into his house when I was 3, right after my grandmother Marion died of breast cancer. My mother, Vivian, was drowning, a single parent working 2 jobs, a marriage already falling apart, and a toddler who wouldn't stop asking for a woman she barely remembered. My grandfather drove down in his pickup one Sunday, packed my suitcase and 2 stuffed animals into the cab, and took me home without saying much of anything to my mother about how long I'd be staying. It ended up being 15 years. The house still smelled like my grandmother's spice cake even though nobody had baked in months. He walked me to a small room he'd painted the color of dried apricot and said, "You'll stay with your grandpa a while. Your grandpa's gonna teach you how to grow things." My mother drove home that same evening. She didn't kiss me goodbye. For 15 years, he taught me how to space tomato plants so their roots wouldn't fight each other, how to read a bus schedule, and later, how to read a hospice care sheet without flinching. He taught me the exact way you fold a towel for someone who's sick and only wants softness against their skin. He taught me that dignity isn't something you can borrow from a title or take away with an insult, and he never once called any of it a lesson. He never remarried. He never took a vacation. He kept driving that bus even on mornings his hands ached from the cold. Once, when I was 7, I asked if he missed the family farm my mother always said he'd lost. He set down his hammer, looked at the sky for a long moment, and said, "The farm went with your grandma. Your grandpa keeps what your grandpa can keep." I didn't understand that sentence. I wouldn't understand it for 24 more years. There was something else I never understood. Every October, without fail, he rose before dawn and drove to the Millhaven post office with a small sealed manila envelope, dropped it in the slot, and drove home in silence. He never told me what was inside, or who it was for. Once, at 8 years old, I asked. He was quiet a long time, then said, "Your grandpa's sending a thank you to someone your grandpa doesn't know. That's a fall matter. The harvest remembers what the planting forgets." I nodded like I understood. I didn't. Children rarely ask twice. When I turned 10, he pressed something small and cold into my palm, a copper birch leaf pin, about the size of a quarter, its veins hammered in by hand, no maker's mark. "There's another one just like it," he said. Your grandpa sends one every year. You keep this one. When you understand, you'll know who to give it to. I put it in a wooden box in my dresser and kept it there for 21 years, thinking it was a keepsake. It was a key. My mother, meanwhile, was building a very different life in the city. For 27 years, she told exactly one story about her father, at charity dinners, gallery openings, the kind of networking events where women introduce each other by their board positions. Her father was a good man, she'd say, but grief broke something in him after her mother died. He couldn't rebuild. He lost the family farm. Some men just can't recover. It was the origin story of her ambition, the shame she'd supposedly climbed out of one committee at a time. I heard it so many times I could recite her pauses, the half-second drop in her voice on the word grief, the tilt of her chin on some men can't. I believed it until I was 30. My mistake was assuming she believed it too. She didn't. She kept the story alive because it fit the woman she'd decided to become. She married my stepfather, Desmond Pierce, when I was 20. He's 58 now, tall in the way that assumes people will clear space for him, and Chief Operating Officer at Meridian Biotech Partners, a firm managing billions across a workforce of hundreds. He has a townhouse in the city, a cottage on the coast, and a watch he checks like other people breathe. Efficient. Calibrated. Hollow. He met my grandfather exactly once, at a Thanksgiving 4 months after the wedding, shook his hand for a polite number of seconds, and then excused himself and my mother's other guests for a call that lasted through the entire meal. In 11 years of marriage, Desmond never once made the 2-hour drive to see my grandfather. Not for a birthday. Not for a hospital visit. Not for anything. That's how a certain kind of man draws a boundary, with a calendar. I first heard the name Renata Cole at that same dinner. Desmond mentioned it 3 times before dessert. She was his managing partner, at the firm since its earliest years. In the car home, he said something I never forgot: Renata notices everything. If she likes you, your career opens. If she doesn't, you disappear. She's the only reason we still matter. My mother didn't disagree. I've spent 3 years working as an oncology social worker at Bellwood Cancer Institute, sitting with people through the worst moments of their lives. I chose that work because someone sat with my grandmother the same way, and I never forgot what that meant. In 3 years there, I'd never once heard anyone mention Meridian in a clinical context. Biotech venture capital and hospital social work don't usually cross paths, and I never thought to look closer. At a holiday dinner years ago, my mother introduced my grandfather to a lobbyist she was courting for her non-profit board as "This is my father, he used to have a farm." Past tense. He didn't correct her. He washed dishes alone in the kitchen for almost an hour afterward, and when I found him there he said quietly, "Some rooms weren't built for old bus drivers." Nothing wrong with a kitchen. I should have said something. I didn't. That silence came 2 years later. My fiancé, Caleb Render, proposed to me that spring. No photographer, no kneeling. He drove me out to a suspension bridge his engineering firm had consulted on the year before, and at the overlook, in the cold, he said, "I want to spend every autumn I have left with you. Do you want that?" I said yes. He gave me a thin gold ring that had passed through 3 generations of women in his family, a hairline solder mark at the base from where his great-grandmother once had it resized to fit her working hand. "This ring's been through 3 generations of Render women," he told me. Not one of them was ever without a job. I still tell people that's the exact moment I knew. I called my mother that night. She was quiet for a few seconds, then said, "We need to talk about the venue." 2 weeks later, over coffee, she slid an envelope across the table, a check for a staggering sum from her personal trust, along with a typed list of 11 vendors she'd already contacted before I'd even told most people I was engaged. "This is a gift, sweetheart, no strings," she said, and then, 3 seconds later, "But you should know the guest list will need to reflect where we are as a family now. My people need to see this done right." I said thank you. It was the most expensive word I've ever spoken. From there, my wedding stopped being mine the way corporate takeovers happen, quietly, procedurally, in emails I was barely copied on. The small local venue Caleb and I had chosen was swapped for a grand historic in 18 minutes from my grandfather's house, twice the guest list, half of it strangers from Meridian. My hospice nurse aunt got bumped to a later brunch, a term nobody on our side of the family had ever heard, to make room for executives I'd never met. When the seating chart finally arrived, my grandfather had been placed alone at table 12, against the kitchen doors, in the smallest font on the page. I printed it and circled his table in red pen. I still have that page. It lives in the same wooden box as the copper leaf pin. Caleb was the one who found the real trouble, a line buried in the venue contract listing my mother as financial guardian of the bride. There's no such thing as a guardian for a 31-year-old woman. She'd invented the title and typed it under her own name, and the venue hadn't questioned it because venues don't question checks that clear. 2 nights later he found something worse, an old email from the wedding planner to my mother, months before Caleb had even proposed, with a slide deck titled Guest of Honor Positioning. Renata Cole's name appeared 3 times on a single slide. My wedding, it turned out, hadn't been planned for me at all. It had been built around a woman none of us had ever met. The next morning my grandfather called, asking if he needed a new suit. He mentioned, almost offhand, that the wedding planner had called him directly to suggest a rental. She didn't have his number. She'd gone around me to get it. At the end of the call he said something that took me months to understand: "Don't worry about your grandpa. Your grandpa knows how to sit in the corner of a room. Your grandpa's had a lot of practice. You worry about your own life." Then he hung up first, something he had never once done in 15 years under his roof. Caleb and I drove out to see him the first weekend of August, planning to tell him everything about the seating chart, the guest list, all of it. We never got the chance. He'd cooked a full dinner from my grandmother's old recipe notebook, and over the meal he asked Caleb about his work. "You build bridges, is that right? Your grandpa likes bridges. Bridges don't have important guests. Everybody uses the same bridge." Later that night, looking for a tool in the basement, Caleb found 12 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, each labeled in my grandfather's careful handwriting, starting with the same year and climbing. Inside the first one was a framed doctorate in medicinal chemistry from a major university, dated decades earlier, under the name Emmett Roswell Calloway. Beneath it, an old ID badge from a Cambridge area pharmaceutical research lab, senior research chemist, and 3 patent drafts for a synthetic compound neither of us could pronounce. Under those, a small bronze medal from a National Health Institute, inscribed for contributions to breast cancer research. And beneath everything, a photograph of my grandfather at 32, standing on the steps of a research building with 3 younger colleagues, smiling. "Your grandpa was not always a bus driver," Caleb whispered. I said he was, for 25 years. Caleb said, before that, he was someone else entirely. "Look at the dates, this is before your grandmother ever got sick." We heard footsteps on the stairs. My grandfather came down slowly, unbothered, like a man walking into a conversation he'd rehearsed for years. "Read it," he said. "All of it. It's your grandma's story more than mine." When Caleb asked why he'd sold the farm, all he said was, "Your grandma loved autumn. The harvest remembers what the planting forgets." Before he went back upstairs, he added, over his shoulder, "You'll understand when your first child is born. Or sooner, if Renata comes to the wedding." The next morning, I found him sealing an envelope at the kitchen table, 2 months early. "Your grandpa knows Renata's coming," he said simply. "Your grandpa's sending early this year." Through the following weeks, the pressure campaign only intensified. My mother offered a compromise over dinner, move my grandfather to a slightly better table, no toast, no walking me down the aisle, and a car arranged to take him home early, before the night's main event. "He tires," she said, stirring her coffee, like she'd already planned every detail. In that moment I understood, she wasn't ashamed of him. She was afraid someone important would recognize him, though she didn't fully understand who or why. Desmond tried a different approach over lunch a few days later, mentioning offhand that Renata had been asking lately about some kind of endowed chair, something unusual for her, and that he'd hate for the wedding to have any distractions during such an important month for him. I asked what chair. He looked at me a beat too long and said it was firm business, nothing I needed to worry about, then changed the subject to flowers. I'd never heard him say that word before. I've heard it in my head 1,000 times since. Then came a call from my mother's longtime mentor on the Arts Foundation board, a woman who'd known me since I was a teenager. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes without asking me a single question, ending with, "There comes a time when we all have to make room for the future generation. You understand, your mother's board vote is coming up. It would be a shame for anything to complicate that." She hung up first. That night I nearly called my mother back and agreed to everything. Caleb found me awake at 2 in the morning, sat across from me without asking why, and finally said, "I'll marry you at the courthouse if you want. I don't need this wedding. You need you." I put the phone down. I sat there and counted, not guests, not tables, but years. 15. That was the only number that mattered. 2 nights before the wedding, the rehearsal was held at the inn for the wedding party and close family. My grandfather arrived by taxi. My mother hadn't bothered sending a car, wearing the same gray suit my grandmother had bought him decades earlier, recently retailored to fit his changed frame. He stood in the marble entryway looking up at the ceiling and said, "Your grandma would have hated this place. She liked small chapels. But that's not why your grandpa's here." I noticed him touch his lapel pocket, checking that the pin was still there. The wedding planner walked us through the schedule and confirmed, again, that my grandfather had been moved back to table 12, against the kitchen doors, despite my written request weeks earlier. I found my mother across the room, laughing with a stranger, a glass of champagne in each hand. She saw me coming and pulled me hard into the corridor by the kitchen entrance, hard enough to leave marks. Desmond followed, smiling in that small private way I'd later understand was the way he smiled when he thought he was winning. "Put your grandfather in the kitchen with the staff," my mother hissed. "He doesn't belong with our real guests. Look at him, still smells like dirt and cheap soap." Desmond added, almost gently, "This is a networking night, not a charity dinner." I couldn't answer right away. And then I saw him, my grandfather, standing just past the corridor entrance, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. He'd heard everything. My mother didn't know he was there. Desmond did, and said nothing. I looked at my mother and said, "No. He sits with me." She started to argue. My grandfather spoke first, calm as ever. "Vivian, you told your daughter to look at your father. Your father's right here. Your father's looking at you." She turned. The champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the tile before she'd even seen him fully. Desmond took a step back and put his hands in his pockets. My mother's mouth opened and nothing came out. 27 years of practiced language, and no script for that moment. I stepped between them and said, calmly, my grandfather sits at our table tomorrow, and every day after. If you can't agree to that, you don't have to come. I'll still get married. I'll still have a family. It just won't include you. My mother found one sentence. Then we won't come. Desmond was already walking to the car. I didn't sleep that night. I moved my grandfather into a proper room myself, after the vendors had cleared out. He sat by the window reading, unbothered. Your grandpa's not new to this, he said without looking up. At your grandma's funeral, someone told me to stand in the back because I was only a husband, not blood. I stood in the back. Your grandma knew exactly where I was. I cried. He let me, without rushing to fix it, that had always been his way. Caleb's mother, Joan, a widow herself, came to see me that night with a lace shawl that had belonged to her own mother-in-law. I'm not trying to replace your mother, she told me. But somebody needs to tell you, tomorrow will still be beautiful. A wedding isn't about who comes. It's about who stays. She sat with me a long while, never once mentioning my mother, and on her way back to her room, she stopped at my grandfather's door. I heard them laughing quietly through the wall, and as I passed I caught him say, your grandma died in the fall. She loved this season. That's the reason for all of it. Joan didn't answer him, she just touched my shoulder gently on her way past. The next morning she asked me plainly, do you know who your grandfather is? I said, yes, he's my grandfather. She nodded slowly. That's enough, she said. Before dawn, I couldn't sleep any longer. I walked to his door and told him, I want you at the head table. I want you to walk me down the aisle. I want you to give a toast. He nodded once. That was enough. My wedding day arrived clear and cold. My bouquet was dahlias, marigolds, and a few sprigs of red maple I'd picked myself at a farm stand. Joan watched me in the mirror and said gently, maple leaves, your grandfather told me your grandmother loved autumn. Down the hall, Caleb passed my grandfather's open door and saw him pinning the copper leaf to his lapel, over and over, adjusting it, unpinning it, until he finally stopped, set his hands on the dresser, and said quietly to his own reflection, Marion, you see me today. You know I tried. Caleb didn't go in. He told me months later it was the first time he'd ever watched a man tell his late wife he'd done his best, in a language only she would understand. That afternoon my mother and Desmond appeared at my door after all, in full formal wear. Desmond and I decided to come after all, she said, her voice too smooth, given the day, given the guest list. Joan simply said, we're glad you came, and never spoke to my mother again for the rest of the night. The ceremony was small and warm, candlelight, a cellist from Millhaven playing softly as I walked in on my grandfather's arm. Halfway down, he whispered without turning his head, your grandma's watching, kiddo. She likes the flowers you picked. 3 hours later, a woman I'd never spoken to would walk across a ballroom and quietly end my mother's carefully built life. The reception began with cocktail hour, my mother trying hard to look unbothered as Desmond checked his phone every few minutes, waiting for Renata Cole to arrive. She finally walked in alone, 62, silver blonde, in a floor-length dress the exact color of a maple leaf in mid-October, no jewelry but a thin platinum chain. She scanned the room the way someone scans a room when they've been searching for one particular person for a very long time. Desmond crossed to her immediately, all warmth. She barely looked at him. Congratulations to your family, she said flatly, and asked the bartender for whiskey, neat. She made polite small talk at a nearby table, her eyes moving in slow arcs across the room, looking, without quite knowing his face, for an older man with weathered hands in a suit older than her own career. Caleb and I sat down at the head table, my grandfather beside me. From across the room, Renata's gaze passed over our table, then snapped back. Not to me. Not to Caleb. To the small copper leaf pinned to my grandfather's lapel. She set her glass down and started walking, slowly, deliberately, like she was counting her own steps. Conversation died at every table she passed. At table 3, my mother stood, glass tilted in her hand, and said Renata's name, soft and hopeful, like a hostess greeting a guest of honor. Renata didn't stop. Desmond tried to intercept her, offering an introduction. Not now, Desmond, she said, without turning her head, and kept walking straight toward my grandfather. I started to stand, some old instinct kicking in to shield him from a room that had never made space for him. He touched my shoulder. Sit down, kiddo. She isn't here to hurt me. She's here to say thank you. Renata stopped 3 feet away, looked at the pin, then at his face, and didn't move for a long moment. My grandfather said nothing, giving her the silence she needed. He'd been giving people that same patience for 80 years. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough, like she'd been carrying the sentence for a decade without ever getting to say it to the person it belonged to. You are the chair, she said. He inclined his head, just slightly. It was the gesture of a man being correctly recognized for the first time in 27 years. She stepped forward and wrapped both arms around him, holding on for a long, silent moment, not the embrace of a colleague, but of someone who'd spent a decade grieving a debt she never got to repay, and had just unexpectedly found the man she'd wanted to thank at her own husband's funeral. Behind me, I heard a glass hit the floor. I didn't need to turn to know it was my mother's. Renata stepped back and, without raising her voice, addressed the surrounding tables. For those of you who don't know, she said, still holding my grandfather's hand, this is Dr. Emmett Calloway. In the late 90s he anonymously established an endowment at Bellwood Cancer Institute, the Harvest Fund. In the years since, it's funded a dozen researchers whose work produced 3 approved therapies. One of them gave me 4 more years with my late husband. I've been trying to thank this man for 10 years. And I want to thank him now, in front of the people who apparently didn't think he deserved a proper seat. At table 3, my mother went rigid and silent, a spreading stain of champagne at her feet, and said one sentence to herself, quiet enough that only the woman beside her could hear. He sold it. He didn't lose it. He gave it away. Desmond recovered faster than the rest of the room. I watched his face cycle through shock, calculation, and opportunity in the span of 10 seconds. He crossed to me and steered me toward the corridor, professional and light-handed, already talking about how everything had just changed, how if I could just casually encourage my grandfather to fund a second chair through Meridian's pediatric division, his career track would open up overnight. He never once mentioned my mother, still sitting alone at her table beside a shattered glass. I looked at him and said, you just watched a woman thank my grandfather for saving her husband's life, and you're thinking about your promotion. He opened his mouth. I said, that's your answer. Go back to your table. He walked back in and sat down at a different table than my mother's, and didn't look at her again for the rest of the night. That was the moment their marriage effectively ended, even if no paperwork was ever filed. I went to the DJ and quietly had him rename a scheduled moment. Instead of a father-daughter dance, he announced a grandfather-granddaughter dance. My grandfather stood, walked to the floor without hurry, and offered his hand with a small bow of the head. We danced the whole song. Halfway through, I whispered, I'm sorry I stayed quiet for so many years. He didn't miss a step. You weren't quiet, kiddo. You were listening. Those are different things. Tonight, you spoke. That's enough. At the end of the dance, he raised a hand, and the room quieted on its own, no microphone needed. My wife had 14 months at the end of her life that didn't belong to her, he said. They belonged to a stranger who funded the science none of us knew the name of. I've spent every year since trying to repay that debt the only way I know how. If you want to honor my wife tonight, don't honor her husband, honor the women you don't know yet. The grandmothers who haven't been saved or thanked yet. The harvest remembers what the planting forgets. My wife knew that better than I ever did. Thank you. Several tables rose to applaud. My mother did not stand. She never lifted her head from the stain at her feet. My grandfather came back to the table, unpinned the copper leaf from his lapel, and held it out on his open palm. You keep it now, he said. Your grandma would want it to be you next. Not to repay anyone, just to remember what the harvest keeps. I let him pin it above my heart. I haven't taken it off since. Later that night, Renata left a small card at his place setting, her personal number on the back, an offer of a quiet advisory seat at Meridian, no meetings required, no public name attached, his to consider whenever he was ready. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without answering yes or no. That was the same answer he'd given every important question of his life. He'd wait until the season was right. The weeks after the wedding were quiet. My mother called repeatedly. I didn't answer. Weeks later, a short press release went up on Meridian's website announcing that Dr. Emmett Calloway, longtime anonymous benefactor of the Harvest Fund, had agreed to serve as a senior advisor to the board. Desmond wasn't mentioned once. Within months, his role at the firm was quietly restructured into something with no direct reports and, eventually, an open-ended leave he never returned from. That same fall, my mother lost a board chair election she'd spent years angling for, undone by a few quiet, sympathetic comments from her old mentor about a difficult family transition. She learned the results alone, by email, at a cafe. That night she called me, her voice different, quieter, almost honest. Everything I said about him for 27 years was wrong, she told me. I know, I said. You don't have to tell me. I'm glad you know. She hung up before I did. It was the first time in my life I let her. In late winter, a manila envelope arrived at my grandfather's house, the same size and stock he'd mailed out every October for decades, but this time addressed from my mother. Inside were pages of her handwriting, not an apology exactly, since she's never quite been able to write one, but something harder, an honest account of how she'd spent her whole life running from him and becoming everything he wasn't. She signed it with the childhood nickname my grandmother used to call her, one she hadn't used in 40 years. I watched him hold the envelope in both hands for a long time before setting it down, unopened, on the kitchen table. Your grandpa will read it when your grandpa's ready, he said. Might be next week. Might be next fall. Might be never. Not every letter has to be answered to be worth writing. My grandfather is 81 now. The tomatoes he planted this spring are already coming in, the same variety my grandmother always liked. I knelt beside him in the dirt last weekend while he thinned the seedlings, the copper leaf pinned over my heart where it's stayed since October. Your grandma will like this year, he said, without looking up, pressing a seed into the soil. Good dirt, good seed, you hear? The harvest remembers what the planting forgets. Your grandma taught your grandpa that. Your grandpa taught you. I understand it now. Not every promise needs to be kept, only the ones worth remembering. He still waits for letters from people who've forgotten him. He still plants tomatoes. He still says less than most men need to. That's one of the ways a person can love someone, by staying, even when nobody remembers why he deserved to.